Okay, so imagine this.
Uh,
You wake up and there's this like ringing in your ears. It's early morning and you roll over expecting to, see your spouse there, maybe say good morning or something. But instead, you find them, well, lifeless.
oh,
Yeah. And it turns out they've been shot. I mean, that's got to be just the most horrifying thing. And this isn't like some movie or anything. This was the reality for a guy named Colby Trickle. That's what he claims he woke up to the morning his wife, Kristen, died.
that's a really disturbing scene to imagine. And yeah, it sounds like something straight out of a thriller. But in this case, when the investigators first got to the scene, everything seemed to point to, well, suicide.
Right. So today we're going deep into this whole case, the Kristen Trickle case. She was only 26 years old when she died. And like you said, it initially looked like she took her own life. But, well, as the investigation went on, all this unsettling stuff started to come out. And it casts a lot of doubt on that initial suicide ruling.
Yeah. These cases, they can be really tricky. I mean, you have to look at everything, right? The evidence they found at the trial, the different stories Colby told. We'll even get into this psychological evaluation that the prosecution used, which was kind of controversial, to try and prove it wasn't actually a suicide.
Right. And this whole case is just full of twists and turns and makes
Yeah.
you think about like trust and how relationships can get all messed up, how love and manipulation can get twisted together.
Exactly. I mean, things aren't always what they seem, are they? Sometimes the most shocking truths are hidden in plain sight, and you really got to dig deep to uncover them.
So let's go back to that morning, back to the scene where it all happened. You've got the coroner showing up, and there's Kristen. She's got this gunshot wound right under her chin, but she looks, well, almost peaceful. And Colby's there, totally distraught, telling this story about how he woke up to the ringing in his ears and found her like that. There wasn't any sign of a struggle, no forced entry, nothing like that. It just looked like, well, a terrible tragedy. So it makes sense why everyone thought it was a suicide.
Yeah, given all that, suicide seems like the obvious answer.
Yeah.
And in fact, the coroner did rule it a suicide right then and there. But, well, we know things aren't always that simple, don't we?
Definitely not. And one of the first things that started to make investigators suspicious was when they started looking at the text messages between Colby and Kristen. Some of them were like normal, loving couple stuff, but then others showed this, like controlling and almost possessive side of Colby. Those texts became super important to the case because they gave this little window into their relationship. And they raised some serious questions about whether Colby might have had something to do with Kristen's death.
Right, and some of those messages are really disturbing when you read them. Like, there's one where Kristen's texting Colby, almost begging him. She says, "Please tell me what I've been doing wrong. I will be waiting." And Colby's response, he writes back, "It's about you being lovey-dovey with other people."
Ugh, that's just creepy. It's like he was trying to isolate her, keep her away from everyone else.
Yeah, that's a classic abuser tactic, you know?
Gotcha.
Control their partner, keep them from having any outside support. It's all about creating this dependence, this feeling that they can't live without the abuser.
And then there's another text where Kristen's like, I'm not talking with anyone, so I have nothing to hide. I'm tired of hurting you. So do what you need to do to feel better. Just don't shut me out. And Colby, he writes back, no, I shouldn't have to monitor your actions, connections, and whereabouts just to make myself feel better. I have enough things to worry about without that on my mind as well.
Wow, that's really telling. He's basically blaming her for his own insecurity. It's all about manipulating her emotionally.
Right.
Classic abuser behavior.
For sure. And those texts, they were just the beginning. They were like those little breadcrumbs leading investigators down a path that led them straight to suspecting Colby. It showed this whole other side of him, a side that didn't match up with this image he was trying to put out there of a grieving husband. And as they kept digging, they found even more inconsistencies in Colby's story about what happened that morning.
Yeah, and one of the biggest ones had to do with life insurance. Colby told police that Kristen had been looking at life insurance policies on his phone, right? Trying to make it seem like she was thinking about suicide. But then surveillance footage from her work showed that she was actually at work when those searches were made.
So he straight up lied. And not just about anything, but about something that could have been a motive for him. That pretty much destroyed any credibility he had. It wasn't just that one lie. His story kept changing. Details kept getting messed up. It got to the point where it was hard to believe anything he said.
Right. If he was willing to lie about something that could be so easily proven wrong, then what else was he lying about? That had to be going through the investigator's mind.
I bet. And then on top of all that, they discovered that Colby was having this like online affair with another woman. And when she testified at the trial, it was super uncomfortable and it just made Colby look even worse.
It must have been awful for her to have to talk about all that in court.
Yeah, it just goes to show you that even online stuff can come back to bite you, especially in a case like this. And those online conversations, well, they raise serious questions about whether Colby was cheating and if maybe he had a reason for wanting Kristen out of the picture.
And Colby wasn't even consistent about whether Kristen knew about this other woman. He told the psychologist evaluating him that Kristen had known for a week, but told police she had no clue. Another inconsistency. Another lie.
So we've got a controlling husband, a bunch of lies, and a secret affair. Not looking good for Colby at all. But there's more, right? What about that psychological autopsy you mentioned earlier? That seems like a pretty unusual thing to use in a trial.
Yeah, it's definitely not something you see every day. A psychological autopsy is basically when a psychologist tries to figure out what the deceased person's state of mind was leading up to their death. In this case, they brought in this Dr. Christensen, and she interviewed tons of people who knew Kristen, looked at her medical records, journals, even her legal history, trying to get a sense of who she was. But here's the thing. She never actually spoke to Kristen directly.
Well, yeah, Kristen was dead. So she had to put together this picture of her mental state using all these secondhand accounts and whatever documents she could find.
Yeah.
I mean, how accurate can that really be? It seems kind of like guessing, doesn't it?
It's like trying to solve a puzzle when half the pieces are missing, right? You got to depend on other people's memories and perspectives, and those can be pretty unreliable. Plus, everyone's got their own biases and feelings that can color their perceptions.
It makes you wonder, like, how can you really know what someone was truly thinking and feeling based only on what other people say about them?
Exactly. And the defense lawyers in the trial, they fought hard to keep that report out of the evidence. They said, look, it's been 2 years since Kristen died. Memories change, people forget things. And everyone who was interviewed was obviously grieving, which probably affected how they remembered her. It's a messy situation, and I'm honestly surprised the judge allowed the report to be used at all.
Me too. It seems like it could be easily manipulated to fit whatever story the prosecution was trying to tell.
Right. And in the end, the psychologist, she didn't even come to a clear conclusion. She said it was relatively less likely that Kristen's death was a suicide. I mean, what does that even mean? It just leaves things wide open for interpretation.
Relatively less likely. Yeah, that seems pretty vague. Like she was trying to leave it up to the jury to decide what to believe. But before we get too deep into that psychological autopsy, let's back up for a second and go back to the morning Kristen died. You said the coroner believed Colby's story. What exactly did he tell them happened?
Well, he claimed he woke up because of this ringing in his ears, and when he rolled over, he found Kristen lying next to him, dead from a gunshot wound. He insisted that he had been sleeping and had no idea what happened. He kept talking about how peaceful she looked and how there were a bunch of alarms set on her phone, trying to make it seem like she had planned it all out.
So he was going for the whole she planned this, it wasn't me defense. But like we said before, there's a lot more to this story. What were some of those red flags that made investigators start questioning Colby's account?
So we were talking about some of the things that didn't add up in Colby's story, right? Those red flags that got the investigators thinking. Well, there's one thing we got to talk about. One piece of evidence that's pretty key. The gun they found, the one used to shoot Kristen. It was a .357 revolver.
A .357. Those are like serious guns, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. We're not talking about some little pea shooter here. This thing was big and heavy, and it raised some big questions about whether Kristen could even, like, physically handled it, let alone used it to shoot herself like that.
That's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if she was so petite, could she have really managed a gun like that?
That's what some people were thinking. One reporter who was covering the trial actually got to hold a similar gun, and even they were surprised by how heavy it was. They said it would have been really tough for someone like Kristen, small as she was, to use it, to actually pull the trigger and everything.
Especially aiming it under her own chin like that. That takes, like, a lot of strength and coordination. It doesn't seem very likely.
Right, and the prosecution definitely picked up on that. They used that whole thing about the gun, the angle of the shot, all of it, to argue that there's no way Kristen could have done that to herself. They said it had to be staged, to look like suicide when it wasn't.
Makes you think, doesn't it? Like, if someone was trying to frame it as a suicide, they'd have to make it look convincing. But going back to that psychological autopsy, I'm still kind of stuck on how much of an impact it really had on the trial.
That's the thing. It's really hard to say how much the jury was swayed by that report. I mean, remember, the psychologist never actually said it was murder. She just said suicide was relatively less likely. But think about it. The defense, they didn't really have a good way to fight back against it. They couldn't put Kristen on the stand to testify, and they couldn't bring in their own psychologist to give a different opinion.
So they were kind of stuck, weren't they?
Pretty much. And we've talked about how these psychological autopsies are based on, like, interpretations and what other people remember. That makes them easy to criticize.
Totally. So to recap, we've got this weird psychological report, a gun that doesn't really fit the story, and a husband who's been caught lying multiple times. What was the final straw? What made them finally charge Colby with murder?
Well, there was this new county attorney who came in, a guy named Robert Anderson. He decided to take another look at the whole case, with fresh eyes. And after going through everything, he decided the original suicide ruling was wrong. He thought there was enough evidence to convince a jury that Colby kissed Kristen.
Interesting that the first attorney didn't go for it, but this new guy saw something different. I guess that's why they say a new perspective can be helpful.
It can be. And for Anderson, it seemed like the inconsistencies in Colby's statements were a big deal. Plus, that controlling behavior we talked about, and then the money he got from the life insurance, those text messages, they really didn't help Colby's case.
No, not at all. And of course, you've got that psychological autopsy saying suicide wasn't as likely. So what were the main points the prosecution focused on during the trial? What was their big argument?
Well, they basically had three main points, three big reasons they thought Colby did it. First, they said he was losing control, that he felt Kristen slipping away. She had moved back to her hometown, was reconnecting with her family and friends, and he didn't like it.
So he's getting jealous, insecure, all that.
Exactly. They brought up those text messages where he was always questioning her about who she was talking to and where she was going. He wanted to know everything. It was like he was obsessed with keeping tabs on her.
And the prosecution, they painted him as this jealous, controlling husband.
Right. And then their second point was the money. Colby got $120,000 from that life insurance policy, and let's be honest, that's a lot of money. And the way he spent it, well, it raised a lot of eyebrows.
Yeah, that shopping spree he went on, that was pretty suspicious.
Yeah.
And then there was that whole thing with the life-size sex doll. I mean, come on.
Yeah, that definitely didn't help his case. The prosecution argued that the combination of jealousy, the money, and then this online relationship he had, that was enough motive for him to want Kristen gone.
It's like a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
Yeah.
Jealousy, greed, and a new love interest on the side. But didn't the defense argue that it was all just circumstantial? Like, they didn't have any solid proof connecting Colby to the murder?
Yep, that was their main argument. They said, look, there's no real reason for Colby to kill Kristen. And they kept pointing to the fact that there was no sign of a struggle and that she looked peaceful when they found her, like you'd expect with a suicide.
That's a pretty standard defense tactic.
Yeah.
Focus on the lack of direct evidence. Did they say anything about those text messages, the ones where Colby was being so controlling?
They tried to downplay them, said they were taken out of context, and didn't really show the whole picture of their relationship. But come on, those messages are pretty damning. They give you a glimpse into what was really going on between them. You can practically feel the tension and the problems they were having. And in a case like this, where so much depends on interpretation and circumstantial evidence, those texts probably had a huge impact on the jury.
I can imagine. It's like having access to their private conversations, seeing all the little fights and manipulations. So after all the back and forth, all the evidence, the closing arguments, it was up to the jury to decide. What did they say? What was the verdict?
Well, the jury, they were out for a while, like days, trying to decide what to do. They had to go over all that evidence, all those different pieces, and in the end, they found Colby Trickle guilty.
Guilty on all the charges.
Yeah. First-degree murder, premeditated murder, even messing with the police by giving them false info. They found him guilty of it all.
Wow, that's a big deal. I mean, it really says something. They must really believe that he killed Kristen, that it was all planned out.
Right. It's like they were saying, we see through your act, Colby. We know what you did. And the judge, he sentenced Colby to life in prison. No chance of parole for 50 years.
Wow. Life in prison. That's a far cry from the whole grieving husband thing he was trying to pull off.
It is. And it just goes to show you, you can't always judge a book by its cover. And truth, well, sometimes it's hard to find. This whole case, it really highlights how complicated things can be when you're trying to figure out what really happened.
For sure. All those twists and turns, the different stories, the evidence that could be interpreted in so many ways. It's tough.
Yeah, and it makes you think about those red flags, the things to look out for in relationships, the signs that maybe things aren't so good, like the controlling behavior, the possessiveness, all that. Those are things you can't just ignore.
Definitely not. This case is a harsh reminder that domestic violence can happen anywhere, to anyone. and it can have terrible consequences. So, after they convicted Colby, what about that psychological autopsy report? Did it change anything? Like, will they use those more often in trials now?
It's tough to say what the lasting impact will be. I mean, it's still controversial, right? There are good arguments on both sides.
Yeah. I mean, I could see how it could be helpful. You're trying to get inside the victim's head to figure out if they were suicidal or not. But then it's all based on other people's opinions and memories. It's not like a DNA test or something. It's subjective.
It is. And because of that, people are going to keep debating about it,
Okay.
whether it should be allowed in court.
I'm sure they will. Well, this has been pretty intense, this whole Kristen Trickle case. It's really made me think. It's a story about trust and betrayal, about how love can go wrong, about the dark side of people.
It is. And it's a reminder that we have to pay attention. We have to question things. Don't just take things at face value.
Oh.
Look deeper.
Absolutely. And Kristen's story, even though it's so sad, it's a reminder to watch out for those signs of abuse. And if you see something, say something. If you know someone who's in a bad situation, don't be afraid to reach out, to offer help. No one should have to go through that alone.
Exactly. You got to remember, staying silent, that's what abusers want. But when we talk about these things, when we bring them out into the open, that's when we can start making a difference.
That's a good point. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a heavy one, but important. We'll be back next week with another story, another chance to explore all the crazy, fascinating things that people do. Until then, stay curious and keep asking questions.